On this episode of Newt's World, I'm continuing our series on election 2024. And this time we're focusing on the presidential race post-conventions and looking forward to the debate or debates in September. And I have to say, I can't think of anyone I would rather chat about this than Michael Barone. We have known each other for something like 40 years. He is the senior political analyst for the Washington Examiner, a resident fellow emeritus at the American Enterprise Institute, and the longtime co-author of the Almanac of American Politics, which is the best single book published on American politics. And I can tell you from personal conversations, his encyclopedic knowledge of American politics, precinct by precinct, is unbelievable. His latest book is Mental Maps of the Founders, How Geographic Imagination Guided America's Revolutionary Leaders. So this is genuinely one of the great students of American politics and one of the great commentators. Michael, welcome and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Well, thank you, Newt, and thanks for the kind introduction. We have indeed been going after this for 40 years in the various entrails of the Capitol building. You went from pariah to speaker in a shorter time than your Democratic colleagues ever expected, but not as rapidly as you yourself had hoped for.
That's a pretty good way to put it. And you once captured, I think, more accurately than anybody else, the degree to which I'm essentially an American Gaullist, a reference which I'm sure 95% of your readers did not understand at all.
Well, the ossuary at Verdun was a tip-off.
That's right. No, it really changed my life. So let me start with some of the most recent events, which, candidly, I'm puzzled by the media's inability to understand. When Robert F. Kennedy Jr. suspended his presidential campaign and then went on to endorse Donald Trump, how significant do you think this will be in shaping the 2024 race?
Well, I think it's of medium significance. Certainly a lot of the standard media outlets have kind of dismissed this and said, look, hey, this couldn't possibly matter at all. He's got relatively small levels of support in the single digits. I think it has some salience. And remember, we're looking at something that looks on the basis of current polling, and there's a lot of asterisks we like to add to that. But on the basis of current polling, we're looking at something that is exquisitely short. I mean, I looked at realclearpolitics.com, average of recent polls this morning, and in the state of Pennsylvania, with 19 electoral votes, pretty significant state, one that Donald Trump carried 2016, lost in 2020, each case by less than 1% of the vote. Donald Trump is leading Kamala Harris by 0.2%, 0.2%. If Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s endorsement is worth a net 0.3%, which the excellent elections polling analyst Nate Silver suggested, that 0.3% is set to double what Donald Trump's lead in Pennsylvania for those 19 electoral votes. That makes the difference between the 235 that he won of today's electoral votes in states that he won in 2020 versus 254, and puts him in position with another 16 electoral votes, which is coincidentally the state of Georgia's number of electoral votes, in reach of 270. So I think that even a small boost is worth something and perhaps can make a whole lot of difference.
I was struck with two things. There's a poll out this morning that shows that nationally, with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. out of the race, they're basically tied at 48-48. But what struck me was this is immediately after their convention. To be tied right after the convention strikes me should be worrisome, much more worrisome to the left than it seems to be.
Well, you have the Nate Silver colleague, Eli McCown, writing this morning that before we've gotten much in the way of post-Democratic convention polls, that Kamala Harris may have gotten her convention bounce in the 37 days of puff press coverage that she's gotten from most of the mainstream media, who have been sitting back there like contented cats, given a little catnip of joy at the Democratic convention and not asking any questions.
If that bounce, she has real momentum coming from where Biden was, which is different than real momentum pulling away from Trump.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see anything like 17 points Dukakis lead going into an 8-point George W. Bush victory in the popular vote and carrying 40 states. I think there's a lot more partisan polarization now. I took a look at one of the convention bounce data, and basically if you take the conventions from 1976 until 2000, and those were mostly conventions where it was clear who was going to win those nominations. So in each case, the winning candidate to a greater or lesser extent was trying to put on a political commercial for 4 evenings of ABC, NBC, CBS coverage in the days before we had 100 cable and streaming options. In those days, you got average convention bounce for Democratic and Republican candidates was 7.2 points. If you look at the conventions from 2004 to 2020, it's 1.8. And I think what we're seeing for Kamala Harris is more in line of that. And if you go back and look at the Trump convention, you might see something that resembles those very minor bounces. But, we're looking at each of these, it's been close. And of course, one of the things that you mentioned that we don't fully know and understand about this election, but that we've seen as critical in electing a president in 2016 and 2020, is that there's a divergence, or has been, between the Electoral College and the popular vote. In 2016 and 2020, Democrats were piling up huge numbers of votes in California and New York and several other states that we could easily name, Maryland, Massachusetts, and so forth, East and West Coasts, that weren't giving them any additional electoral votes. I mean, 1996, Bill Clinton carried California by 13 points. He got 55 electoral votes out of that. 20 years later, Hillary Clinton carried it by 30 points. She got 55 electoral votes out of it. Donald Trump won that election despite losing the popular vote by carrying states in that case like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania by a total of 77,000 popular votes. Is that still going to be a factor in 2024? We don't know for sure. I mean, the analyst Nate Silver says, well, it's still a factor, but a little less so than in 2020 and 2016. The analyst Sean Trendy, who was one of the first analysts back in 2013 to write about how the white working class vote potentially could be shifting heavily towards the Republicans in a way that other analysts really failed to understand, says, well, the Electoral College advantage may not work as much for Trump this time as it worked in the past. I think it's still there to some extent. I think that to some extent, Trump may be piling up votes in places like rural Texas, rural North Florida, where he's not piling up a lot of popular vote margin, which is not adding electoral votes to him. And to the extent that he's winning Hispanics and blacks in states like California and New York, which he's not going to carry, where he's not going to get electoral votes, he may reduce the Democratic margins there from what they were in those previous elections. So that would tend to even out or to reduce his Electoral College advantage. But I think that it's still probably there to some significant extent. And I think those two analysts I mentioned don't disagree with that. It's still there. And you begin to wonder, as an old political consultant, why the Republicans don't try to get more popular votes and win easily with a big popular vote margin. And Donald Trump does some things that I think are not well calculated for that. And you have to ask why the Democratic Party doesn't cut its losses and cut its wins and perhaps stop pleasing all those California left-wingers and maybe try to get a set of issue positions that's more palatable in the Midwest, in states like Georgia and Arizona, which were narrowly fought last time. Instead, they nominate a San Francisco Democrat who basically, she did come from the East Bay. She lived in Oakland and Berkeley for a while. She's had staffers say that she no longer stands for a lot of the platforms she ran for president on in her 2020 candidacy, which ended in 2019, when she was for banning fracking, when she was for getting rid of ICE and immigration enforcement, where she was talking about getting rid of private health insurance. We've got tweets from anonymous staffers saying, well, hey, she's not for those things anymore. Nobody in the mainstream media has thought to ask her questions about, are you no longer for those things that you were so vehemently for? And the perfectly reasonable question of, and not unsympathetic question necessarily of, you've changed your mind on this issue. What prompted you to change your mind? What assurance can you give voters that you're going to continue to have as president these issues that you now say that you're not supporting as candidate?
Given that she's essentially a San Francisco radical trying to work her way to the middle, which is a classic traditional position, you win your party's nomination on the right or left, and then you run to the middle if you can. I thought picking Tim Walz was an odd choice in that sense, because he's actually further left than she is.
He's further left than she is. He's kind of the town left-winger in some small town in the Midwest. The small town he grew up in Nebraska and Mankato, Minnesota, and Blue Earth County, Blue Earth, as we pronounce it. I think it's more like one syllable for Minnesotans. She liked him at the comfort level, and she didn't take Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. I just laid out for you how crucial Pennsylvania is and the fact that it seems to be a very closely divided state. And it's a state, by the way, Newt, where her previous opposition to fracking, her vehement opposition, her promise to ban all fracking, that's a real no-no in about 63 of the 67 counties in Pennsylvania. They've been making a good living and doing well for America, for oil and natural gas production out of fracking in Pennsylvania. They don't have a left-wing Democratic legislature like New York does next door where they've banned fracking. Pennsylvania has been going to town. People have been making good livings in communities which seem to have been, left behind in the post-industrial era. And now they're doing well, and she wanted to stop fracking, which was the basis of that kind of a clean energy economy. So she's got some real questions to answer there. And Tim Walz, who seems to have a significant problem with padding the resume, is not ideally situated to get it. I have to assume that there's some level of personal comfort with him, that she thought he was more her kind of person. I think there will be an interesting story to tell someday about that selection. Perhaps she will come to think, as John Kerry, the 2004 Democratic nominee, came to think that his selection of a vice presidential nominee, then North Carolina Senator John Edwards, was kind of a mistake.
I think when you lose, you always think it's the vice president. And when you win, you're sure it had nothing to do with it. I have to say, by the way, Mark Thiessen had a very interesting comment this morning in his column. He said, only one vice president, while sitting, has won the presidency in 188 years, and that was George Herbert Walker Bush. He describes it to the country wanted a third Reagan term and suggests that nobody wants a second Biden-Harris term.
Well, I think that's right. We've had several vice presidents who've gone on to run for president. Martin Van Buren, who established the first Democratic National Convention in 1832. He was copying the anti-Masonic Party. He was elected president. Jackson was a popular president. You had Richard Nixon as the sitting vice president in 1960, narrowly loses, representing a very popular president, President Eisenhower. He gets rounded off 50% of the popular vote, as does his opponent. Not quite enough to win. Al Gore in 2000 carries the popular vote narrowly, loses the Electoral College, loses Florida by an adjudicated 537 votes. George H.W. Bush wins by what turned out to be a comfortable margin with 53.4% of the vote. That's the closest thing to a landslide, by the way, that we've had since that time in 1988. We don't have landslides anymore. We're partly a polarized country. And I think the other reason we don't have landslides anymore, because we had an electorate that had experienced the Great Depression, that had experienced World War II, which changed so many people's lives in so many ways, those big upheavals. And when they got a president who seemed to produce prosperity and who seemed to produce peace, they would cross usual party lines and vote for that president. They often wouldn't vote for other candidates of his party, but they'd vote for that president again. We saw it with Eisenhower in 56, Johnson representing the Kennedy-Johnson administration in 64, Nixon in 72, Ronald Reagan, the last one in 84, maybe with echoes of that for the first George Bush in 1988. But at that point, we ceased to have an electorate that had a substantial number of voters who remembered the Great Depression, who had personal memories of World War II. Obviously, we don't have an electorate of that kind anymore. So we're not getting landslides, and we're not getting anything even like George H.W. Bush's 53.4% of the vote against Michael Dukakis after being 17 points behind.
You mentioned the white working class and the degree to which it's gradually migrated away from the Democrats, and where Trump, in that sense, is kind of a remarkable figure who is a billionaire who appeals to people who are dramatically different economically but share a common culture. But what I've been struck by is you're beginning to see with Latinos and African Americans in the working class level a similar shift towards Trump. Even with Kamala Harris on the ticket, I suspect Trump will get a much higher percentage of black male votes than any Republican, maybe since Eisenhower.
That appears to be the case. Certainly with the Trump-Biden pairings showed Trump doing better among black voters than previous voters. And, black voters have been semi-unanimously for Democratic candidates ever since Barry Goldwater voted against the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Well, people of our particular generation have to remember that was 60 years ago. And maybe that's just not so relevant for a lot of black voters anymore. We do not have Jim Crow in the South, despite what various black leaders and Democratic politicians are saying. We're not going back to that kind of segregation which you as a Southern Republican opposed. Eventually, people in a subgroup that is voting unanimously for one side for historic reasons come to see other issues as more important. We're certainly seeing that with Hispanics, where you see the non-college educated Hispanic vote, it may be going for the Democrats by single digits, maybe going 50-50 in some cases. And that's going to make a difference in California Central Valley congressional districts, for example. It's going to make a difference in a wide variety of areas. Gwinnett County, Georgia, it's going to make a difference. It's going to make difference in various places in North Carolina, Northern Virginia, and so forth. It's kind of a quiet vote because it doesn't have media spokesmen who are coming on from the left wing who are vibrantly persuading that they're more oppressed than ever and they've got to vote this way. They've got to vote left wing, or they've got to rebel against the current status quo. Or their rebellion against the status quo is a rebellion against what they consider to be inflation, illegal immigration. Turns out not all Hispanics are saying, well, gee, we really want more illegal immigration. To the contrary. So this is an interesting development, and it's part of a trend that's been apparent for a while. When you became Speaker of the House in 1994, one of the things I noticed is that Republicans carried a lot of the affluent districts then that are hopelessly Democratic now. Those districts have been out of reach for Republicans for a while, but also I remember when you were the only Republican congressman from Georgia. When Georgia had 10 congressmen, your district was partly rural Georgia, Carroll County and so forth, Noonan, Georgia, and partly Coweta County, and partly going into metro Atlanta. And all those rural small town districts in Georgia were electing Democrats. That ain't the case anymore. We're looking at a change that started in the 90s. You did a lot to start that. I remember you predicting in the 1980s, you said, look, the Republicans are going to do better in the South because these old Southern Democrats that have been there since the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, someday they're going to retire. And their districts have been voting Republican for president, except maybe when Jimmy Carter was on the ballot. They're going to vote Republican for congressman. We've got some young Watergate-era Democrats that have won those districts. They're politically adept. They're going to run for other office, or we're going to take them out some year that's a pretty good year for Republicans, and that's going to change the political landscape of the House of Representatives and of the balance in the presidential race. And indeed, it has come to pass. You are joining, in effect, the eminent mid-20th century political scientist E.E. Schatzschneider. Schatzschneider wrote all these articles about how it would be much more rational in America if we had one obviously liberal political party and one obviously conservative political party. This idea of conservative Southern Democrats who were staying with the Democratic Party because of the Civil War, or liberal Republicans who were staying that way because they opposed the industrial labor unions in the 1930s. They were based on obsolete history, and you ought to separate it into political parties. And your one-time colleague or predecessor in the House, Richard Bolling of Missouri, wrote books about how the Democratic Party should become a clearly liberal party and use all those votes from those conservative Southerners, force them to vote for the liberal policies and things. The Schatzschneiderites, I think most of them were pretty confident if you had one liberal party and one conservative party, the liberals would win most of the time, which is something they wanted to see. Well, Mr. Schatzschneider is gone. But his prayers have been answered. We have two political parties divided partly on economic issues, but a lot on cultural issues and basic cultural standpoints. And that's the evolution that's taken place. And as you said, it certainly started in the 1990s when Bill Clinton began running better in the big metropolitan areas than Democrats had before. But when you and House Republicans were capturing a lot of those not high income Southern, rural, Midwestern districts and so forth that had been voting Republican for president, but not for Congress, it started. Donald Trump accelerated that trend, and we're seeing it work out today. It is still with us. It has left the two parties pretty closely balanced, and both of them. One of the reasons why we haven't seen the kind of legislative compromise and cooperation that you as Speaker were able to do with President Bill Clinton, put two would-be intellectual baby boomers in a room with policy ideas and let them go at it with both of your staffers on both sides nervous about what you guys would agree to. That produced some significant legislative achievements on welfare, on fiscal balance, a budget, and so forth that are difficult to achieve today because the parties are so easily balanced. They both dream of the trifecta. They both dream of getting the presidency, the Senate, and the House. And in fact, in recent times, that has happened. The Republicans got that in 2004. Democrats got it in 2008. Republicans had it briefly and by narrow margins in 2016. Democrats had it by even narrower margins in 2020. And both parties are thinking about it now. You know, you've got the Democrats musing about the idea of, well, if we just avoid losing more than that one Senate seat in West Virginia, maybe we can pack the Supreme Court with President Harris and Speaker Pelosi's installee, Hakeem Jeffries, winning a House majority. And those are possible things, although it's kind of a stretch to think they're only going to lose one Senate seat given the lineup of Senate races. And you've got Republicans thinking about a trifecta as well. Well, we've got a good chance to pick up the Senate majority, they think. President Trump has a good chance to win the election, as we've been discussing. Nothing like an assured victory. You got a 50% chance of winning it if it's a 50% race. And the House of Representatives, well, Republicans have a majority, and maybe they're going to increase that majority. So both parties do that. You don't get much compromise in the interim. If both parties think that they're going to get a trifecta in the next election, they'll say, why should I settle for half a loaf now? particularly if the other side writes the fine print and I don't even get half a loaf, when I can get a whole loaf, maybe, after the next presidential election. Does that analysis make sense to you?
That is part of what's happening. I also think, in a funny way, the two parties have moved further apart by having all the liberals in one room talking to themselves and conservatives in one room talking to themselves. The gap you have to cross in order to get to a deal is much wider than it was in the 1990s. But, I have to ask you one question, just because in many ways, you're much more of a historian than a political scientist, and you put these things in a context. Were you surprised when Biden decided not to run for re-election?
I was modestly surprised. Yes, I was. I thought he would stick in there. I think that Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama, the first president in 100 years to stick around Washington after he left the White House, was probably putting the ice pick in his ribs and basically telling him, at least what I've seen attributed to Pelosi, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. The easy way is the way we're doing it now. The hard way is we do it next week and I say you're an incompetent, senile person and you have to leave. Which way do you want to go? Nice little presidency you got there. I wouldn't want to niche in history. I wouldn't want to see anything happen to it. And remember, Nancy Pelosi is from San Francisco, but her political roots are in Baltimore. It's a little bit of a rough town politically. It was a two-party town for a while. When her father was the Democratic mayor for some years, there was also Republican mayors like Theodore R. McKeldin, got black voters. Tommy D'Alessandro, Nancy Pelosi's father, got the Italian and Irish voters. So that was an old-fashioned politics. She's 84 years old. She's old enough to remember that kind of politics. And, well, as a person that's partly of Italian, indeed Sicilian descent, I'm not going to go any farther into suggesting what she may have observed within the Italian-American community in Baltimore, from which she sprang and which she has fond memories.
There's a terrific movie called The Offer, which is the making of The Godfather. It's really, really well done. And it's based, of course, on that one line. I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse. And I think there was probably a magic moment when they made Biden an offer. And he figured out, or more importantly, Joe figured out, they couldn't refuse it. I thought he would hang in until the pressure just began to be so obvious and so powerful. But I have to say, Callista and I were in Rome for the Trump-Biden debate, and we actually got up at like 3 a.m. to watch it live. And it was so staggering to watch. I mean, Biden just seemed like he wasn't there. I don't know what your reaction to the debate was, but I tuned in as a good partisan thinking, boy, if we could get 2 or 3 mistakes out of Biden, but we got 90 minutes out of him. He never was able to fully engage.
Well, we're of roughly the same generation, and people's declines in their health and in their capacity to do this kind of public speaking can decline fairly suddenly. Was Biden in this bad a shape in 2022? I think the answer is not. Did he just have a bad night? No, I think he had obviously been in some decline. So this is one of the factors we have to live with. If you go back and read the history of World War II, you see a lot of the leaders drop dead. Military leaders and this and that, or like John McCain's grandfather, an admiral in that war, retires in 1946 after a grueling career in the Pacific Theater, and he sits down in an easy chair and drops dead. President Roosevelt dies at age 63 after a cardiac event the year previous. I've read somewhere that his blood pressure was 340 over 180. My internist tells me that anybody in that condition today, his recommendation would be immediate hospitalization. People can just decline. And one of the points the Democrats have made is, hey, Donald Trump this year is the same age that Joe Biden was at this time in the cycle 4 years ago, which is true. Now, Donald Trump seems to be very much still with it and capable of responding and making arguments and things. But I saw a clip the other day of an interview he did on Oprah Winfrey's show. in 1988, which is a time he would have been, 42 years old. And he was faster. He was more articulate. He was smoother in his presentation then. If anything, even more self-assured, although he had not yet been elected president of the United States. He was thinking about it, and so forth, than he is today at age 78. Can I do all the things physically that I did 40 years ago? Not necessarily.
One last topic I want to ask you about. We're currently in the debate about the debates. Given the general pattern, do you think it really makes that much difference?
Well, I think the June 27th debate certainly made some difference, probably more so than any political debate that we remember of all time. I mean, it's generally thought that then Vice President Nixon lost the 1960 debate. But if you go back and watch the television or the audio tape of it, Nixon performed very ably in that debate, as did Kennedy. Kennedy had greater charm, I think, but they're both highly competent people in their 40s at that time. I think it can make a fair amount of difference. It's interesting that the Democrats initially said, well, you got to debate in the same format, the same channel with the same network, ABC, that you had agreed to President Biden in. And Trump said, well, maybe not. And then he said, well, maybe I'll do it. And then the Democrats said, yeah, but the ground rules have to be different because we want to change it. Well, that's one of those process arguments, saying, well, we're going to change the process and so forth. I have an old saying that I've developed in covering politics, which is that all process arguments are insincere, including this one. Both the Democrats and the Republicans are making insincere arguments, and we'll see how they come down to on debates. But I'm also looking forward to the Vance-Walz debate. Vice president debates don't get as much attention as they should. Sometimes they signal something has changed. I remember the 1992 debate between incumbent Vice President Dan Quayle and Senator, then later Vice President Al Gore. It was the first baby boomer debate. It was a rock'em sock'em debate, and they just savaged each other and went at it like crazy. Neither of them, interestingly, is a factor in the debate this year. Neither of them seems to want to play a part in national politics, which is certainly their prerogative. They can claim to have served constructively as vice president, I think, in each case. That sort of style, I think it'll be interesting. Walz has stated a whole bunch of things that just turn out to be untrue or allowed to be stated, misstating his Army rank, misstating the form of fertility treatments that he and his wife had. He misstated when he was running for Congress in 2006, had said he had been given an award by the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce. He'd grown up in Nebraska. And I thought the fertility argument, the Walzes had IUI treatment, not IVF. IVF would have given him a political talking point, but maybe he just got those confused. The military position, he was applying basically for a military position, holding it temporarily, but did not complete the requirements when he retired from the reserve status, as he was entitled to do. So you can say, well, he just made mistakes there. How do you make up out of thin air that you got a Nebraska Chamber of Commerce award when you never did? What kind of mindset is it? Was there some award that he had somewhere that suggested that and he maybe embellished or changed it? I don't have the answer to that question. Plus, why would you think when you're running for Congress from Minnesota that you got a Nebraska Chamber of Commerce award would be a really killer political argument for your election?
It's a little bit like he apparently was a volunteer offensive coach, but was never the coach. But of course, if you watch, Kamala refers to him constantly as coach because they want to communicate. He's just one of us. He's an everyday kind of guy.
It reminds me of the proper way to address a person who has been lieutenant governor but was never governor of the state. The proper way to address them is as governor. And I have done that with a number of former lieutenant governors of both parties. And I can report to you that when you say that to them, their faces light up.
I'm with you. I think that actually those two guys have a totally different set of talents. But watching the two Waltz and J.D. Vance debate may be one of the more interesting periods of the whole campaign because they bring very different set of skills. Both of them will be very aggressive, I think.
They've both been unafraid to be provocative, which can be a high-risk characteristic, as you may have reflected occasionally in your career.
I have thought about trying to be provocative, but I've never quite gotten around to it, as you know. Listen, Michael, I'm an enormous fan of yours. I think of you as a personal friend as well as a colleague in this almost half-century journey trying to understand the American system. The fact that you would be willing to talk to us from Amsterdam, I'm deeply in your debt. I want to thank you for joining me. Your latest book, Mental Maps of the Founders, How Geographic Imagination Guided America's Revolutionary Leaders. It's a great read. It's available now on Amazon. It's in bookstores everywhere. And also, our listeners can follow your work at WashingtonExaminer.com. But thank you very, very much for joining us.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you to my guest, Michael Barone. You can get a link to buy his book, Mental Maps of the Founders, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.